This is John Hamry. I'm the president at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm also the Langone Chair for American Leadership. And it's in that mind frame that I'm joined today by Dr. Walter Copan. This is going to be a remarkable opportunity for us. Dr. Copan is the director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. He's an undersecretary in the Department of Commerce. But more important is that Dr. Copan in this environment has used his platform to really think fundamentally about how does America really become a more innovative society. He took the effort and pioneered important research on a study called Return on Investment Initiative. This is how do we use the resources that we spend in the government that have tremendous value? How do we make that work and become an engine of productivity and prosperity in the American society? I'm very grateful that Dr. Copan would be with us today. And he has led this really marvelous institution. I mean, Americans should know more about NIST. It's a gem. It's really a gem. And what it does for us is crucial. Today, however, we're going to spend our time really talking with Dr. Copan about the NIST Green Paper, Unleashing American Innovation. It was released about a year ago. Its goal was to identify changes that we needed to make in the American science policy landscape so that we would have more innovation, more energy brought and could commercialize that, and then to find a way where we could transfer that enormous energy and knowledge to the private sector so that everybody could benefit. Walt, thank you. I'm so grateful that you would join us today. I've got to get my little camera adjusted here. I'm so grateful you would join us today.
Thank you so much, John. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the interest that the Center for Strategic and International Studies has in these topics, because ultimately we know that economic security and national security are intimately intertwined.
Walt, why don't you tell us what was the problem you were trying to solve with the Green Paper?
It wound up being a part of the President's management agenda in 2018, a cross-agency priority that we called Lab to Market. And it's a continuation of a close inspection in the United States as to the translation of technologies from the research laboratories into the commercial marketplace, ultimately into value for the American society. NIST has a very special role with regard to US innovation and policy leadership for technology transfer. Many are likely familiar with the Bayh-Dole Act and the important step forward that it was able to represent for the United States. We also wanted to ensure that we were able to bring together the stakeholder community to look at the issues, expert practitioners, potential recipients of technology from the US industry, the entrepreneurial community, the venture capital community as well. And so as someone who's actually been involved in the private sector for much of my career, as well as in the US government, I had seen firsthand the opportunity to move the United States forward with regard to innovation leadership. In many regards, the United States is seen globally as the leader in innovation. Really, we're the home of the venture capital structure that's been emulated now around the world. And so our conversation brought literally thousands of individuals, organizations together to provide feedback formally, as well as through written responses, through several public fora that were held across the United States. And also as part of this journey, we undertook a deep review of the body of literature around technology transfer, around the transition from laboratory to market, policies, practices, and looked at the challenges as well as the opportunities to move the United States to the next level.
Well, I always used to think that Americans were pretty good at technology innovation, but you're saying we've got issues. What happened?
Well, we are in a very interesting competitive environment. The United States certainly is still seen as an innovation leader, but increasingly the United States is being challenged by global competitors. And as a portion of the global investment in research and development, other nations have stepped up dramatically in both fundamental R&D, in research and development infrastructure. And we've also seen that as a result of globalization, the move of US manufacturing capabilities and R&D centers from US domiciled corporations overseas, that there's been a brain drain of sorts that's accompanied this. And we also know that the legislative underpinnings for US technology transfer, the core of our innovation system, is 40 years old. And so many of the elements that we are looking at today are how do we enhance the speed, the agility of our academic institution, our federal institutions, to be able to create public-private partnerships in a much more agile way to operate at the speed of business. There were certain desires to put oversight and controls in place. And over the years, there have been new ways to provide that kind of oversight and control, but yet the legislation and policy has not yet been modernized. And so this whole idea of converting research, building agile public-private partnerships is at the heart of the review of the return on investment initiatives and forms the core of the Green Paper. And also, as we were talking earlier, the development of the tech transfer concept was in the Cold War era. And now we are looking much more broadly at economic competition and to ensure that the United States, even in a world where other nations may be playing by different rules to take advantage, that the United States, through its innovation engine, continue to be the world leader in innovation outcomes to the benefit of the United States economy, to our society, and ultimately for the positive benefit in the global balance of trade.
Walt, you're such an expert in this field. We're so lucky to have you in government right now. I'm just a novice. I think it would be helpful if we could give a bit of a framework for our viewers. It's the federal government. The law of the land is that research and development done by the federal government belongs to the public. And we do have a framework where we're supposed to get that information to the private sector for them to exploit, and we spend about $150 billion a year. Could you just share with us what is the framework like now, so that we have an idea about the changes that you're going to say we need to influence? We need to just kind of know where we are as a country right now.
Indeed, yeah. Thanks so much, John, and this whole world of innovation, technology transfer is one that's been an important part of my life's journey, my career journey as well, both in the private sector and in public sector settings. The core legislation 40 years ago was the Stevenson-Weidler Act, and it established the core mechanisms for technology transfer. It actually made technology transfer, this whole concept of translating results from laboratory to market and to benefit society, a mission of every federal institute, every federal research laboratory. It also established the Federal Laboratory Consortium, which brings together the 300 plus US national laboratories. It created new authorities for cooperative research and development agreements. And actually, new approaches such as prize competition authorities that would create an element of competitive assessment, if you will, around innovative concepts to allow them to move forward. The Bayh-Dole Act also was a seminal piece of legislation, as mentioned a little bit earlier, and it allowed the recipients of federal funding to maintain title to and to manage their inventions, created a framework for how agencies and institutions such as universities would license that intellectual property, having an ownership interest, but being a steward in the interest of the US public, in the US taxpayer, to ensure that it would go effectively to the private sector and have the broadest possible impact. So it's really those two fundamental pieces of legislation that established the mandate. And the stimulus was the idea of the strong intellectual property system that we have in the United States should also create an incentive for inventors, for institutions, to move the innovation process forward and to provide to the full extent possible, the value of U.S. research investment to the interest of the public.
Well, you outlined that these two fundamental laws establish the framework, but the actual performance to move insights, technical insights, scientific insights into the private sector for commercialization has not been as great as it should be. What's wrong? Do we just have we don't have the incentives right? Was the legal framework not right? Has the world what do we need now to think about how do we change that?
I think the U.S. should be proud of the legacy of leadership that we have in innovation and technology transfer. But with a hyper-competitive global environment and with some of the bureaucratic processes that we still have in place that harken back to the 40 years ago, back to 1980. And we can see that we in the United States need to streamline, need to be able to use the tools of the digital economy more effectively to enable greater impact from our research investment to actually translate to the U.S. economy. We should be proud of the legacy that our universities, our federal laboratories have made over the years, over the decades. There are trillions of dollars of value that have come to the U.S. Marketplace, to our GDP. And whole market sectors have been created as a result of the federal investment in science and technology. As we look at GPS and its impact, of course, the atomic clock program, where NIST is a key player, have always been enabled by the power of intellectual property, basic research, then being translated into commercial value. And another element that's so important for us today, in addition to considering the environment globally, is that entrepreneurship and the role that startup companies play for value creation in our economy is now a much more significant part than it was when the Bayh-Dole and Stevenson-Weidler Acts were put in place. It was back then anticipated that the primary commercializers of technology would be large US corporations who would be able to take on the technology. There would be a transition from the laboratory to the corporate sector. We also have important programs such as the Small Business Innovation Research Program, the SBIR, which is an important part of every science institution's mission that's from the federally funded side. And as a close partnership with the SBA. And so having certain tools available to us, but also recognizing that the kinds of partnership vehicles that, that we are looking at now, bringing the public sector and the private sector together, need to have greater flexibilities. There are new types of deal structures that were not anticipated back in those days. The role of software and the role that executable code would have and location-based services was not even thought of during those days. So driving public-private partnerships in new ways, agility, and recognizing the importance of innovation ecosystems as well. That in many cases it requires not just a single organization, but a network that provides support, that creates the value chains from the source of the technology all the way through to the creation of the marketplace. All have to be taken into consideration in ways that are much different than we had before. So we're doing well. Other parts of the world have developed very good practices and have invested heavily in these areas for innovation. And so the US needs to continue to be agile and consider how we can make the most of our historic leadership role in science, technology, and innovation for the future benefit and competitiveness of our country.
Walt, you really, you just answered the question I was going to ask you, which is, okay, what's not working and what do we need to do to change? The green paper talks about the need to modernize our system. So let me, if I may, there were 5 strategies that you identified in the green paper. These were, as I understand, the result of your surveying very broadly with the science, innovation, technology, university, the business development communities in America. First of all, just share with us, how did you develop this? Who did you talk to? What does it reflect? Before I ask you about the 5 strategies, what was involved in developing this green paper?
It was something that was a top priority for me as I entered the Department of Commerce and took on the role as director of NIST. And it was very early on a topic of conversation with the U.S. administration, with Secretary Ross, and with the White House. And it was really seen that there are so many stakeholders in the innovation system in this country, looking at technology growth and also translation into market value in a whole series of sectors. And so we try to reach out broadly to market sectors from legacy industries, from emerging industries. So here we are looking at the enablement of the internet, the advent of advanced communications industry, and certainly 5G and the Internet of Things applications. We sought inputs from the healthcare sector and looking at the future of the bioeconomy and the energy sector, the role that precision medicine will play, in particular in remote medicine for the future. And so it was a very holistic outreach to industry, to the practitioner community also of the U.S. Federal Laboratory Complex. And I mentioned that there are over 300 federal laboratories across the network from all of the science and technology agencies. And indeed, each of them have different needs and different viewpoints with regard to engagement with the private sector and the kinds of partnerships that would be most meaningful to them. And as a result, the request for information that was issued as a Federal Register notice that went out, and as part of the dialogue kickoff, we had an event that was called Unleashing American Innovation, at which Secretary Ross spoke. We also had some great involvement from across the science and technology agencies, from the National Science Foundation, from the National Institutes of Health, and from the Patent and Trademark Office and many others. And so it was important to that everyone who was invited, which was really across this very broad sector, had a chance to have their voice heard. These were sessions that were held in open forum. They were recorded. There were very detailed notes that were taken and reported. And also in response to the request for information, there were a broad series of comments received from all stakeholder communities, public sector and private sector alike, and certainly from all across civil society. We're all stakeholders in this because it's the future of the outcome of our science and technology system that we're talking about. And as we're looking at the importance of scientific leadership, the whole concept of ROI, return on investment, was not really looking at financial returns, but really looking at how do we maximize the opportunity for the best ideas that come from federally funded research to see the light of day and make an impact for improving our society, improving our quality of life, moving our economy forward. And we recognized as part of this journey as well, and looking at statistics, that there are actually quite a few technologies that were seen to be highly valuable that arose from federally funded research that were sitting on the shelf somewhere. And the view of many was, can't we put more of these technologies to work? What's keeping us from doing that? And so this broader conversation that we had resulted in the distillation then of 5 key strategies, and then a series of areas of focus for action in modernization.
Colleagues out who are listening in right now, let me just say, you just heard Dr. Copan isn't going to do this. I will. To talk about this is just quintessentially the greatness and the culture that NIST brings to the federal government. This capacity to look into the future, understand important, complex technical developments, and then create an honest platform to bring people together and to have this collective wisdom grow. It is just a foundation for well, it's a wonderful institution. It's really helped America. Americans don't know enough about it. That's why I wanted to say it. Well, let's get into talking about these 5 elements of the strategy. The first element is about correcting regulatory impediments that exist in tech transfer. Would you describe that for us?
This is a very interesting part of the process, John, because many of the key findings that came out of the study, and I would say that there were many contributions to identifying the top priorities for action, and it's truly an honor to be the leader of NIST and the trusted position that we have within the science, technology, and the commercial community in the United States as well, and also our role globally. So we could have these types of conversations. We could capture the wisdom of the nation in this journey, and so we identified a series of areas that would provide increased confidence to business by taking licenses from federally funded technologies. We found that it was important that some terms that were sometimes confused by industry, by licensees, and by institutes alike regarding margin rights or government use licenses were not as clearly defined as they need to be. And so margin rights is a provision that was initially put in place to ensure that there were remedies available if there were licensees that were not actually moving a technology onward into commercial use. The original legislation was established with the view that if somebody is taking a technology and basically wanting to sideline it, basically to put it off to the side so that they could continue on with their existing business line or existing technologies, this would give the sponsoring government organization the ability to step in and to do something about that, to change the license, to ensure that another entity could take the technology forward if due diligence toward commercialization was not being exercised by the licensee. Since the very beginning of the Bayh-Dole and Stevenson-Weidler Act, there actually have been some very appropriate terms and conditions put into license agreements that would ensure that that licensees were being held accountable for moving technologies forward, to doing their very best in line with the agreement that they entered into. And so another issue that had come forward is also with regard to pricing debates. The idea was that, well, perhaps margin should be used to control pricing if, you know, a federal agency or the general public felt that a licensee of a federal technology was not being fair in their commercial practices, their trade practices. And again, we know quite clearly from the original legislation that was not the intent. And of course, we know in the US that we have a series of other remedies regarding price management in the marketplace and ensuring that that fair practices prevail. And so these issues around clarification of margin rights, which for some corporations, for some investors had given them some concern, was called out as an important series of improvements for the regulatory side. It was also identified that current copyright restrictions on federally funded works didn't really anticipate the importance of software. And we know that that having software available for open source utilization, for example, so you have trusted software available with appropriate conveyance of copyright to other users that will take that to the next level and develop it, is missing in government works. And we know that software, digital products generally are a major part of the gross domestic product of the United States. They're over $1 trillion and growing rapidly every year, much faster certainly than sector averages elsewhere. And so it was seen as very important that strategic decisions should be able to be made around software that would result from federal investment, in particular at our federal laboratories. And we heard loud and clear from industry that the lack of having copyright protections actually limits the ability to commercialize technologies, to see them more fully utilized for the benefit of the US economy. Without certain protections, the products are being given away to everyone, including our global competitors. And so having the ability to make intelligent decisions about software, about digital products, about the copyright protections that are so important in our economy will certainly be an important part of the regulatory improvements. The other element that was seen in the review of the Stevenson-Weidler Act was that there were some federal entities that have certain rights and that others do not. And so providing greater access to the tools of the trade, so to speak, to make it much more broadly available to use tools that would provide greater flexibility. I, on a personal note, had been at the Department of Energy system. I worked very closely with DOE leadership and the federal laboratories, the national lab system of the US, to develop a new mechanism that was ultimately ratified and put into practice, called Agreements for Commercializing Technology, and provided new flexibilities for public-private partnerships. It created greater abilities for intellectual properties to be developed and managed with greater flexibility by the parties to agreements. And also organizations such as NASA, for example, and the importance of the Space Act, which gave greater flexibility in entering into research and development agreements, so-called Space Act agreements or other transaction authorities, had proven to be very valuable in that part of the federal sector, encouraged public-private partnerships and commercialization of innovative technologies. But those approaches were not available to many of the other parts of the federal sector. And so looking at making it easier for industry to engage, making it easier for entrepreneurs to engage, to reduce the amount of bureaucracy in the process, all were seen as very important elements of accelerating US innovation by removing some of the barriers, some of the roadblocks or speed bumps, if you will, to the kind of agile partnerships that are so necessary in the 21st century. And so we heard loud and clear from industry, from academia, from entrepreneurs alike. These are important changes for us to consider as part of the modernization effort. It's important for us to realize that although we have many different science and technology agencies with different missions, making the interface with their laboratories, with their technologies much easier, much more seamless, and to provide greater uniformity, if you will, of access to a range of tools, all were seen as important priorities for the modernization of the Stevenson-Weidler as well as the Bayh-Dole Acts.
You know, well, in some sense, you've already, touched the second strategy, which is a increasing engagement with the private sector, and getting technology available. I went out and I've studied a little bit. You go to universities. Universities actively market, their breakthroughs.
Right.
The federal government doesn't do poop. I mean, they are really terrible about identifying the kind of things that they are doing. Tell us what would you do here? This is kind of in that second category.
It is in the second category, John, and I bristle a little bit about that because I do know that colleagues across government and also certainly within important parts of the research and development sector across the Department of Defense, for example, really have been working very hard to try to make their technologies more accessible. It's just clear that we need to bring a different mindset to how we communicate, the effectiveness of the communications and the tools that we use, whether it's websites or other types of approaches, but also as you look at kind of the broad number of federal laboratories, it's so hard for industry and for entrepreneurs to sometimes find what they're looking for. And so a big part of this is building first of all a mindset that communication of technology opportunities is a good thing. That if the federal sector is not good at it, there are mechanisms to allow for partners to actually take on that marketing role, and that's part of the legislation. In many cases, these relationships haven't necessarily been developed in a fruitful enough way to make the technologies as accessible as they should be. And so in part, it's education, new tools that and provide the broader range of tools in the toolkit to allow greater engagement with the private sector. And also, I think that increasing the actual incentives for federal scientists and inventors to innovate, to engage with industry, to manage conflict of interest. That's another challenging area because there are certain restrictions in conflict of interest that certainly universities also face. And having conflict of interest and conflict of commitment, something that needs to be dealt with. By its very nature, as you think about the whole act of technology transfer and the creation of new relationships with the private sector, that by itself creates conflict of interest and also perceptions of conflict of interest. So dealing with these issues transparently and providing new tools to help manage conflict of interest is a journey that we're certainly on, and the academic community is actually a great benchmark for the federal sector in the way in which these issues are being addressed, and also in the kind of recognition for innovators that's just so important to keep incentives strong, that people who are public servants know that it's actually okay to engage with the private sector with regard to the transitioning of technology successfully. And getting those incentives right, developing a common language that allows scientists, whether in academia or in federal research institutes elsewhere, to just speak the language of business more effectively, to help entrepreneurs understand the value proposition of the technologies and what they're likely to be able to do with an invention that may still be quite early stage. Understand, is this risk worth taking? And can I bring along an investor group to syndicate to invest in this technology-based business that will take this technology and perhaps others from academia or other federal institutes forward as a bundle and create new value for our economy. Many of those issues were not really thought of, 40 years ago.
Walt, you're highlighting, I think the conflict of interest issue is really big. I mean, it's really an important one to work through. I think it's workable, but we have a lot of, kind of folk myth that's evolved about what people can and cannot do and what's a conflict of interest. And so I'm so glad that you've taken the lead on dealing with that. Let me ask, if I could, Walt, the third element of your strategy deals with creating a more entrepreneurial R&D workforce. Now I was a government guy for 25 years. I'm very proud of that. I feel government service is really noble. I really do. But there's a big divide between when you're in government and you're in the private sector. When you're in the government, every problem comes to you. When you're in the private sector, nothing comes to you. You got to go get it. Okay. I mean, there's a real divide in mindset. So the question is, how do we get government R&D professionals to think more, entrepreneurially about getting their ideas implemented? What are your thoughts?
There are, I believe, an important series of steps that need to be taken in this journey. One is simply the recognition that each of the federal institutes actually have a mandate for technology transfer. So being able now to create the mindset, the expectations, is a journey of discovery. It's a journey of education, of aligning expectations with incentives for the kind of work to be done, and the recognition, as I mentioned earlier, that so much of the value that's created in the U.S. economy from new technologies actually comes through the entrepreneurial journey. I'm an entrepreneur myself, have done a series of startup companies, and early in my career, I was part of a venture capital group, corporate venturing group, and so I've seen it from both sides, from the side of the entrepreneur seeking investment, as well as the one who's holding the purse strings and looking at the range of opportunities out there to add to an investment portfolio for strategic impact as well as for returns. So the creation of the right kind of incentives, the opportunities to gain training and experience, and increasingly we are seeing the academic community and the federal research community partnering more and more, utilizing tools to build the awareness first, and then the core skill set of what does it take to be an entrepreneur, even if you never take that journey of leaving the federal sector or taking a leave of absence to support an early stage company in its start. Then perhaps have the opportunity to cycle back. But the training programs such as I-Corps, which was one of the initiatives that was founded really early on with the National Science Foundation, has been broadly adapted, if you will, by other funding agencies for extramural science and technology. And also the venture community, the seed and early stage investment community, have been very important stakeholders here, because new technologies and entrepreneurial talent is really the seed corn for what they're investing in. And so they want to make sure that people are well prepared. And so it also harkens to the value of the entrepreneurial ecosystem that I spoke about earlier. The recognition that these are not acts that are taken in isolation to take a concept and move an innovation journey forward successfully into the marketplace. It really does take a village. It takes people who are stakeholders and mentors and coaches. It takes the core training, and in many cases there are boot camps that are available to scientists to actually look at what it takes to build out a business plan, what it takes to understand what a business opportunity canvas looks like, and to create a very succinct statement of value proposition, and translating very often geeky concepts, that they would start off with, but into the language then that other entrepreneurs and investors and business leaders can understand, and can catch the fire of the concept and move it forward. So community building, education, the recognition of entrepreneurship, the alignment of incentives. Many of these are not policy issues. These are cultural issues. These are capacity building issues. And there's a broad spectrum of organizations with demonstration of excellence across a broad continuum. Some of them are really just starting, and others have very mature ecosystems and close partnerships with the investment and the corporate community that can very much be a part of this. And I mentioned earlier on this whole concept of management of conflict of interest. It's not an easy journey, but there are solutions, there are approaches and tools to be able to help with the management of conflict of interest. And so part of ensuring this greater return on investment to our country is looking at that strength of our workforce, the preparedness of our innovation seed corn, if you will, and to create the kind of joy that comes from a scientist seeing their technology actually adopted in the private sector, seeing it have an impact on other people's daily lives, and sharing that joy with others through these various approaches is certainly a key part of it. But that's definitely something that ongoing investment from the federal sector can help. But culture building actually is it starts from within, and the desire of leadership to create the kind of environment where entrepreneurship can flourish.
It's a big issue. It's a really big issue. I do want to make sure I get through the other two elements of the strategy. The fourth element, Walt, is about needing better tools for technology transfer. As I mentioned, you go to, there are several really important associations that are in the business of getting, university technology moved to the commercial sector, but I don't see much on the government side. What are your thoughts?
We see this as a tremendous opportunity within the government side. The Federal Laboratory Consortium, FLC, is actually an organization that operates under the wing of NIST, so to speak. It is NIST is the host institution for the 300 plus federal laboratories, and there is a business website that they have that has information about some nearly 20,000 technologies and insights into user facilities and the laboratories themselves. There's a lot more work that can be done in terms of just aggregating technologies, making them easier to find and easier to search. And there's actually a new collaboration that's been established between NIST in our role with the Federal Laboratory Consortium and the Association of University Technology Managers, AUTUM, which is the institution that supports innovation and tech transfer from our nation's universities and actually has international affiliates. And so the idea here is let's work together. Let's not recreate tools, but let's find ways of leveraging and adapting the very best ones. And the other element here is to the extent possible to create portals that bring all these technology opportunities together instead of having people have to go search out 300 individual institutions or websites, and even more on the academic side. And then the other is being able to track where inventions go from federal funding. There's a program that's called iEdison. It was really stewarded and initially developed under the auspices of the National Institutes of Health. But the National Academies of Science some years ago recommended that be actually transitioned to NIST as part of modernization, make this easier to access and important data to be captured and shared so that technologies could be more easily discovered.
Each one of these I want to follow up, and I just to say to our listeners, we're going to have another session because right now it just is so much material to get in front of all of you. I'd like to do a session with Dr. Copan, and he's agreed he would do it where we can get feedback from you and we can respond and we can quite widen the network. Well, let me just ask, the fifth element of your strategy was about enhancing the understanding about global science and technology. Now, this is becoming a bit controversial because we're becoming paranoid a little bit about global cooperation. And yet it's a foundation of science. It's a foundation of technology development. Tell me your thoughts on this.
It is very important for the United States to continue to be globally engaged. And I've mentioned the very competitive environment in which we find ourselves in the United States today, and also the fact that around the world there's been advances in in innovation systems, new approaches that have been pioneered in other nations. It's important for the United States to be able to understand those elements, to look at how we measure our own success and impact. I talk about return on investment being much more than dollars in versus dollars returned, but looking more broadly at the impact of innovation. And I'm, of course, at the nation's Measurement Science Institute, National Metrology Institute, called NIST. But each of us who have been organizational leaders know that the principles of management are that you get what you measure. And so are we measuring the right things, or are we measuring what's convenient? And so looking broadly within this nation and also for external benchmarks, there's plenty of room for collaboration as we look at best practices globally. And certainly like-minded nations are very interested to continue to partner with the US, not only in science and technology, and to advance our cooperation. We know that that's the foundation of international trade as well, and the importance of standards and the utilization of common measurement tools so that we can facilitate global trade and understand fair practices and the ability to measure those. So the other part of this is looking at carrying out economic analyses of what do our technology transfer efforts, our efforts to transition new discoveries into impact for our society. Just a few examples, recently the economic analysis of several market sectors that are affected by GPS, global positioning, was carried out, and NIST had the Research Triangle Institute who won the contract to carry out that study. And they looked at what happened when GPS actually became available to civilian use in the early 1980s. And it's resulted in only a limited number of market sectors in well over $1.5 trillion of economic value. And certainly we've seen many other examples of important economic and societal impacts. So having approaches to measure results, benchmarking, recognizing that there are pre-competitive activities that we can do together where like-minded nations can share best practices appropriately. It's a good thing.
You know, colleagues who are listening in now and will be watching this later, I think the NIST Green Paper is an enormously important thing for America, and I think we all ought to be trying to find ways to promote it, because it's thoughtful people interacting very openly to develop a good set of ideas. So my last question, Walt, is where's it going? How are we going to get this done?
Well, right now, we are in the midst of addressing all of the aspects, all of the 5 strategies that we've just been speaking about, John. And we are in the midst now of moving very rapidly, very effectively across the U.S. interagency to deliver a new legislative proposal for action yet in this Congress. And also, as a follow-on to that, a streamlined bi-dole regulation that will be addressing the majority of the findings under these 5 strategies that we've discussed. We are also taking this as an opportunity, as a result of the national conversation about U.S. innovation, on making the most use of the tools that we already have. I mentioned the importance of prize competitions and partnership intermediary agreements and the like. There's so much that we can be doing already, and so those conversations are well underway and being encouraged with the Federal Laboratory Consortium, with the science interagencies that NIST is part of, and our committee responsibilities for the future of U.S. technology transfer, innovation, and the Bayh-Dole Act. I mentioned the new partnership with the Association of University Technology Managers, and working together collaboratively on leveraging practices and tools, both within federal research as well as within the academic community, and the things that we can do together to look at the opportunities for the new incentives, the training programs, building out our entrepreneurial workforce. Really in this journey, we need support from the community. And as we all know, when you're in a legislative and policy journey, you move it forward with help from the stakeholder community, and it's important that their voice is heard on the Hill. And lastly, just to harken back to some of the early comments that I had shared, this is something that we can't afford not to do as a nation, in view of the competitive environment and the linkage between technology transfer, economic security, and national security. I believe, across the federal sector, have a shared sense of urgency to act, to move forward. Now is a wonderful time. We've had great conversations, and we're converting this into action now. And part of that action is also the legislative and policy agenda.
You know, Walt, just to underline and stress exactly what you said, this is not a partisan issue. Both parties could get enthusiastically behind this. This is about America's prosperity going forward. This is about how we compete more effectively. The world is becoming much more competitive. We are naive to think that we're ahead, and we're going to have to race to keep up. Fortunately, we have an organization like NIST, fabulous organization, and your leadership to give us a roadmap going forward. So we will be engaging this audience again, and you, Walt, hope you'll help us so we can advance this agenda. I think this is crucial for America's prosperity. I'm so grateful that you would take the time to be with us today.
John, thank you so much. Thank you for the great work that the Center for Strategic and International Studies does. And it is indeed time for continuing our conversations about these various matters. We're all about removing the roadblocks to U.S. innovation, being able to provide the kind of tools to move forward as rapidly as possible, and to provide the kind of data, the kind of insights to enable U.S. innovation to continue to flourish, regardless of the global environment. And also, let's not forget the importance that advanced manufacturing plays in all of this. As part of the COVID pandemic response, we've seen challenges within the United States supply chain. Products that we wished at this time were actually manufactured here, and that the U.S. was not as reliant on other nations for certain products and ingredients. And so part of the conversation is also, how can we leverage U.S. advanced manufacturing as an innovation driver for the benefit of this nation and for our resilience and our leadership in the future? Thank you, John.
Walt, we're going to call you back. It has been a great session. We've got much more to learn, but I want to mobilize everybody that cares deeply about our competitiveness in America's future to join us. And I'm grateful for you. Walt, thank you. And all of your colleagues at NIST, tell them that we greatly appreciate all they do for us in America.
Thank you so much, John. It's a real pleasure joining with you and all of our viewers today, and look forward to continuing our conversation.
We will. Thanks, Walt. Thank you. See you now. Goodbye.